At the beginning of 1944, the Germans were suffering serious setbacks on the Eastern Front. The Soviets had finally lifted the siege of Leningrad and had forced the German armies to retreat toward Latvia and Estonia. In this sector of the front was the majority of the non-German volunteer divisions of the Waffen SS. These foreign volunteers faced the Red Army in Narva and, in an epic defense, managed to stop the Soviet advance for 6 months, at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. The siege of Leningrad was finally broken on January 27, 1944, and by then, the Soviet army had already managed to definitively break through the Nazi defenses, pushing Hitler's troops out of Soviet territory. Throughout January, the Germans were relentlessly pushed westward, and by the end of the month, the Red Army was approaching the German defensive positions in the old city of Narva. Narva held great symbolic significance for Nazi mythology, as in that same place, the Teutonic Knights had fought against Eastern tribes in the 13th century. Furthermore, in Narva, the Bolsheviks had been repelled on numerous occasions during the Estonian War of Independence in 1919. As a reference to this past, the tank battalion of the Nordland Division was named after a Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights who had defended Narva centuries earlier. The Narva Isthmus was a strategically vital position for both the Nazis and the Soviets, as it was located between the Gulf of Finland to the north and Lake Peipus to the south, making it an ideal defensive position for whoever controlled it. Moreover, it provided access to the Baltic Sea through the Gulf of Finland. If the Nazis held this position, it would be easier for them to deploy troops by sea from northern Germany, with the possibility of crushing the Soviets on their own territory. For the Soviets, success in the operation in Estonia would open an unobstructed route to advance along the coast toward Tallinn, which would force the German army group north to flee Estonia for fear of being encircled. On February 22nd, Stalin ordered the breaking of the Narva defenses and launched a surprise attack against the city of Pärnu, with the aim of annihilating the German forces in Estonia, directing 2 armies toward the southeast of the country, continuing the advance through Latvia, and opening the path to East Prussia and Central Europe. On the same day, the Soviet Union presented Finland with peace terms, believing that the Finnish government would accept them to avoid an imminent Soviet attack. However, Finland considered the terms unacceptable. Stalin realized that to keep the Finns negotiating peace, he had to make the war in Estonia seem dangerous enough to compel them to remain at the negotiating table. To influence Finland, Stalin needed to take Estonia. Within a week of the start of the Soviet offensive, the German 3rd SS Panzer Corps had committed its last reserves and was desperately fighting to hold defensive positions along the line from Vitino to Klopizi, while German army units, decimated in the fierce fighting around Leningrad, fled westward. Although the combined efforts of the army and the Waffen SS in the southern sector managed to repel enemy attacks, and the Waffen SS units in Vitino managed to resist the enemy, the Soviets made advances both north and south of the city, forcing the SS troops to evacuate to avoid encirclement. On numerous occasions, overly confident Red Army units, assuming the Germans were in full retreat, suddenly encountered SS armored units, which attacked without hesitation against enemy forces vastly superior in number. However, these localized successes could not change the strategic situation, and by January 26th, the Germans began a large-scale retreat toward Estonia. The Soviets pursued them and reached Narva, near the border between Estonia and the Soviet Union. The Soviets launched a very intense offensive, and one by one, the defensive points held by the Waffen SS east of Narva were overcome. By February 1st, all the bridges over the Luga River had been blown up to delay the Soviet advance, and the Germans began to retreat toward the defensive lines of the Narva River. In the city of Narva itself stood 2 ancient fortresses. On the western bank was the old Germanic castle of Hermannsburg, while on the eastern bank was the old Russian fortress of Ivangorod. At that point, the river that separated them was crossed by the main bridge that allowed road traffic into the city. Slightly further south, there was also a railway bridge. On the eastern bank of the Narva River, on the northern outskirts of the city, the defense was under the charge of the Engineer Battalion of the Nederland Division. On the western bank, the northern end of Narva was protected by SS Artillery Battalion 54. The central part of the city was defended by the Engineer Battalion of the Nordland Division, while the division's artillery regiment was positioned at the southern end of the city. Finally, the southwestern approaches to Narva were protected by SS Regiment 23. In addition to these Waffen SS units, there were also several small battle groups formed from the scattered remnants of various army infantry divisions, as well as some police units. Despite this impressive deployment, the German defenders were subjected to Soviet artillery bombardment almost as soon as they reached their positions. The ancient city of Narva was soon reduced to a sea of rubble. The destruction was so great that it is said that the commander of the Nordland Division, SS General Fritz von Scholz, set up his command post in a battered civilian bus, allowing him to move when circumstances required. The Soviets attempted to cross the Narva River on 2 occasions in early February, but were quickly repelled by Waffen SS troops, including the reconnaissance platoon of the armored battalion of the Nordland Division, the Hermann von Salza. The first months of the battle eerily resembled the trench warfare of the First World War. Both armies were firmly entrenched in their positions, and every inch gained over the enemy came at the cost of hundreds of lives. Ground engagements occurred daily, and the bombardment was constant. On March 7th, the city suffered an especially fierce air raid that lasted 12 hours, followed by an equally brutal artillery bombardment. Fortunately, the civilians had already been evacuated, and the defenders were well established in prepared bunkers. Although casualties were relatively light compared to the intensity of the bombardment, significant damage was caused to the defenders' vehicles, guns, and equipment. The old Germanic fortress of Narva was completely reduced to rubble during those days. On February 12th, the Soviets finally managed to get a considerable force across to the western bank of the river on the northwestern outskirts of the city. The situation quickly became critical, and all available troops were hastily sent to that area. The bombardment of March 7th was followed by a concentrated Soviet attack against the bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Narva River, defended by a German regiment. The tenacious Dutch volunteers resisted each of the Soviet attacks and even managed to launch their own counterattack, forcing the Soviets to retreat in panic. The regiment's commander, SS Captain Wolfgang Jürchel, was awarded the Knight's Cross in recognition of these achievements, although his efforts would prove futile in the long run. Despite these impressive defensive successes, it became evident that the Soviet pressure on the so-called Lilienbach sector was increasing, and that sooner or later, the Germans would be overrun. This nearly occurred when Soviet tanks broke through the German lines and rapidly advanced toward Ivangorod and the main bridge over the Narva. Only the arrival of the 1st Company of the Panzer Battalion Hermann von Salza, equipped with Panther medium tanks, managed to stop the Soviet advance. In the following weeks, the Waffen SS units on the Narva front focused on consolidating their defensive positions as much as possible. The clashes were of lesser intensity and were designed more to keep the Germans under pressure and prevent them from resting than to drive them from their positions. Meanwhile, the artillery bombardments against the German lines continued incessantly, causing a gradual increase in casualties among the defenders. Despite the determined efforts of the Danish volunteers, Soviet units managed to penetrate the German defenses, although they suffered many losses due to SS artillery fire. A key strongpoint in the southeastern sector with the codename Sunshine was taken and occupied by the Soviets. A Danish SS non-commissioned officer, Egon Kristoffersen, who served as a squad leader in the 7th Company of the Denmark Regiment, perceived the developing crisis and quickly assembled an assault group from the scattered survivors of his company. Without hesitation, Kristoffersen and his men charged at the enemy and, in fierce hand-to-hand combat, managed to drive the Soviets out of the German strongpoint. For his quick reaction and initiative, Kristoffersen was immediately awarded the first-class Iron Cross by his battalion commander. This is just another example of the commitment and bravery that the men of the Waffen SS, both German and foreign volunteers, demonstrated throughout the war. Despite these localized successes, it was clear that the German defenses on the Narva front were weakening more and more and becoming increasingly vulnerable to Soviet attacks. The Germans had understood that the time would come when the situation in Narva would become unsustainable, and so they had begun the construction of another defensive line about 24 kilometers, 15 miles further west. Built on elevated terrain, which gave the defenders a good field of fire, These positions were named the Tannenburgg Line. In the months that followed, this line of fortresses would become a death trap for anyone who attempted to approach. By mid-June, German intelligence detected Soviet preparations for a new massive offensive against the city of Narva. It was considered unlikely that the defensive positions in front of the city could withstand an attack of such magnitude, and so it was decided that the 3rd SS Panzer Corps would have a much better chance of containing the offensive at the Tannenburgg Line rather than within the city itself. On July 24th, the Soviet 3rd Baltic Front, composed of about 20 divisions of the Red Army, launched its offensive against the Narva defenses. Although some German units had already begun to retreat toward the Tannenburgg Line, a rapid Soviet pincer movement left the 3rd SS Panzer Corps threatened with encirclement. Although most of the German divisions managed to resist, the Soviets ultimately succeeded in maneuvering around the city. The Waffen SS units began to retreat from the eastern bank of the Narva River as they hurried to complete the withdrawal before the city was completely surrounded. In the early hours of July 26th, the SS engineers blew up the main bridge between Hermannsburg and Ivangorod. However, when the smoke and dust cleared nearby, German soldiers were horrified to see that the bridge was still standing. The engineers had already returned to their quarters to begin their evacuation and were unaware of the disaster that was about to occur. It is still unknown whether it was a miscalculation, an incorrect placement of explosive charges, or an act of sabotage. The engineer commander, SS officer Gunther Wanhofer, had stayed behind to oversee the destruction of the bridge. Now he could only watch in horror as Soviet troops charged across the intact bridge. Wanhofer ran to rally his men and bring them back, but his vehicle broke down and he had to continue on foot. However, other retreating German troops in the area realized what had happened at the bridge and called for mortar fire on the Soviet advance. The precision of German fire managed to force the Soviets to retreat from the bridge and return to the eastern bank of the river. Wanhofer was severely reprimanded by his superiors, who even threatened to bring him before a court-martial and hang him in the main square of Narva. Instead, he and his men were sent on a suicide mission. When Wanhofer and his engineers returned to place additional explosive charges on the bridge, they were met by a furious hail of fire from Soviet troops stationed on the eastern bank, determined to prevent the destruction of this vital river crossing. Wanhofer's men, exposed and without cover, fell like flies under the relentless Soviet firepower. Despite the intensity of enemy fire, the engineers managed to complete their mission. This time, the bridge collapsed into the Narva River. Meanwhile, the bulk of the Waffen SS divisions were retreating in stages toward the Tannenburgg defenses. Although most units managed to reach their assigned positions within the defensive network, the General Seifert regiment was overtaken by the speed of the Soviet advance and became isolated behind enemy lines. Attempts by a rescue force to reach the besieged Dutch soldiers failed. The survivors of the General Seifert regiment split into small groups to try to return to the German lines independently. Only about 20% made it back. The rest were either captured or eliminated by the Soviets. As soon as the Germans reached the Tannenburgg line positions, the Soviet attack struck them with full fury. The southeastern part of the Tannenburgg defenses was occupied by the Denmark regiment, whose Danish volunteers suffered terribly when the Soviets managed to break through their lines at several points. The Soviets knew that if the Germans managed to stabilize a defensive line at Tannenburgg, it would be nearly impossible to break it. So they tried to kill as many Germans as possible before that could happen. It was a true massacre, but eventually a significant part of the German forces managed to retreat to the Tannenburgg line. Fortunately for the Germans, the position had been well chosen and the terrain favored its defense. The German positions were concentrated in front of a chain of elevated hills running from the coast, known as the Swedish Wall, and around 3 strategically vital hills. They knew that a frontal attack against such well-defended positions would be devastating for the Soviets, but Stalin had no qualms about sacrificing the lives of his own soldiers. As the Germans settled into their positions, the Red Army gathered unit after unit of tanks, and as soon as they were ready, an attack was ordered against the so-called Orphanage Hill, defended by German Marines. The first Soviet attacks were launched with great speed in an attempt to surprise the enemy. With tank support, the Soviets quickly overran the German positions and took the eastern slopes of Orphanage Hill. Immediately, the Denmark Regiment launched a counterattack, sending troops mounted on motorcycles and armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. In a brief but fierce battle, the Soviet tanks were destroyed and the front restored. But this was only the beginning. The next day, the Red Army launched a massive attack along the entire Tannenburgg front. A force of about 30 Soviet tanks attacked the sector defended by the 10th and 11th Companies of the Denmark Regiment. The Danish SS soldiers calmly waited until the Soviets were at very close range before opening fire with their Panzerfausts. Within minutes, nearly half of the tanks were engulfed in flames and the rest fled. However, the success was short-lived, as under the cover of darkness, Soviet troops managed to infiltrate the German lines, encircling and annihilating both Danish companies. By July 27th, the situation for the 3rd SS Panzer Corps looked grim. The casualties were severe, most units had lost up to half their personnel, and some had been completely destroyed, including their tanks. SS Captain Steiner, facing a shortage of armor, partially compensated by concentrating all available artillery at the most critical points. The battered German units were now facing at least 17 divisions of the Red Army, 6 of which were armored. In addition, the Soviets had managed to repair the bridges over the Narva, which meant their reinforcement capability was increasing by the hour. On July 28th, the relentless Soviet pressure finally forced the Germans to abandon Orphanage Hill. The survivors barely managed to reach the next defensive point, Grenadier Hill, to the west. The Soviets, now victorious, turned south and strongly attacked the positions defended by a regiment of Danish SS volunteers. Only the intervention of German artillery units managed to stop the Soviet advance. However, a subsequent attempt by SS troops to retake Orphanage Hill failed. On July 29th, the Soviets resumed their attack with a massive artillery barrage and airstrikes, preparing the ground for a new offensive. On August 3rd, a determined Soviet attack managed to penetrate the German positions on Grenadier Hill, and was only repelled thanks to the timely intervention of a combat group formed by men from the Corps' penal company. These Waffen SS soldiers, dishonored and relegated to the punishment unit, managed to drive the Soviets from the hill in fierce hand-to-hand combat. After the failure of this last Soviet attack, a brief period of calm followed as both sides gathered their forces to continue the battle. It would be the last one. On September 16, 1944, the front around the Tannenburgg line erupted in violence again as the Soviet Third Baltic Front launched a new offensive. Unfortunately for the Germans, Hitler had decided that the Corps was expendable and was willing to sacrifice it in an attempt to deny Estonia to the Soviets. However, despite Hitler's wishes, Colonel General Ferdinand Schörner, commander of Army Group North, was determined to ignore his orders and allow the evacuation of Army Group Narva. On the night of September 18th, all Waffen SS units were withdrawn from the front and pulled back to Western Estonia. The exceptional performance of the Waffen SS volunteer divisions on the Narva front resulted in the awarding of 29 Knight's Crosses to Waffen SS soldiers for their actions during these battles. However, no number of medals could hide the fact that time was running out for the Germans in the east. Stalin's calculations were precise. The final breakthrough of the German defenses at the Tannenburgg line opened a new and victorious era for the Red Army. On September 1st, 1944, Finland announced the end of its military cooperation with Germany to sign an armistice with the Soviet Union. 4 days later, Finland allowed the Soviets access to its territorial waters. With the Soviet offensive in Latvia threatening to complete the encirclement of German troops in Estonia, Army Group North began to prepare the withdrawal of its troops from Estonia, an operation that was given the code name Asta. On September 17, 1944, a naval force under the command of Vice Admiral Theodore Buchardi began the evacuation of German units and Estonian civilians. Within 6 days, around 50,000 soldiers and 1,000 prisoners had been evacuated from the country. The elements of the German 18th Army in Estonia were ordered to retreat toward Latvia. During the withdrawal, the German command released thousands of Estonian conscripts from military service. However, as Soviet troops took control of the Baltic territory, they began to forcibly recruit local inhabitants. While some ended up fighting on both sides, thousands of Estonians joined the Forest Brothers partisans to avoid conscription. Soviet rule in Estonia was re-established by force, and the Sovietization of the country was carried out between 1944 and 1950. The forced collectivization of agriculture began in 1947 and was completed after the deportation of 22,500 Estonians in March 1949. All private farms were confiscated, and peasants were forced to join state collective farms. In addition to the armed resistance of the Forest Brothers, there were also underground nationalist groups formed by students. Most of their members were captured and sentenced to long prison terms. However, the Soviet reconquest of Estonia had a crucial impact on the outcome of the Second World War. The Courland pocket, the last fortress of the Reich on the Eastern Front. After the fall of Estonia and the withdrawal of the Waffen SS, the Red Army intensified its offensive in the Baltic states, forcing German forces to retreat. With Estonia in Soviet hands and Finland out of the war, Stalin ordered a full-scale attack on Latvia and Lithuania to eradicate the German presence in the region. The Soviet offensive in the fall of 1944 succeeded in cutting off the escape routes of Army Group North, trapping it on the Courland Peninsula, where Axis troops held out until the end of the war. Despite being completely surrounded and with no chance of reinforcements, the entrenched troops in Courland offered fierce resistance. Against all odds, they managed to hold their positions from October 1944 to May 1945, withstanding repeated offensives by the Red Army. Only when the Second World War officially ended and Germany's surrender was confirmed did the defenders agree to capitulate to the Soviets, marking the conclusion of one of the last pockets of resistance of the Third Reich on the Eastern Front. After the devastating Soviet offensive of the summer of 1944, the northwestern tip of Latvia became an unprecedented military stronghold. This region, known as Kurzeme, spans 27,285 square kilometers between the Gulf of Riga and the Baltic Sea, with its westernmost point just 25 kilometers from the island of Saaremaa, separated only by the narrow Irbe Strait. The landscape of Kurzeme features a varied and challenging topography: dense forests of oaks, birches and conifers, numerous lakes and marshy areas, vast dune formations and elevations such as Mount Geisinghans, 312 meters, that naturally transformed the peninsula into a geographic fortress against the Soviet advance. The military isolation occurred as a direct consequence of Operation Bagration. This Soviet offensive virtually obliterated the German Army Group Center during the summer of 1944, culminating on October 7th when the offensive on Riga definitively severed land contact between army groups north and center. This isolation created what strategists called the Courland pocket, a defensive perimeter of approximately 250 kilometers from Tukums in the east to the port of Liepaja in the west, with another 300 kilometers of Baltic coastline. Within this perimeter were trapped approximately 500,000 troops, a combination of German and Latvian forces, who were forced to organize their defense with the sea as their only route for supplies and eventual evacuation. The defensive formation in Kurzeme consolidated forces under three main commands: the 16th Army protecting the east, Group Grasser guarding the center, and the 18th Army defending the western coast, all under Ferdinand Schörner. This force included approximately 500,000 fighters, 350,000 Germans, 148,000 Latvians, and 1,200 Estonians, with naval support from Admiral Thiel and air support from General Pflugbeil, possessing 510 armored vehicles and 170 aircraft. After recapturing Riga, the former Latvian capital lost in 1941, the Soviet High Command, Stavka, faced a strategic dilemma: concentrate three Baltic fronts to completely eliminate the Kurzeme enclave, or assign a smaller force to contain the pocket while directing the bulk of troops toward East Prussia and Berlin. Contrary to expectations, Stalin opted for the first option, underestimating the resistance he would encounter on the peninsula, a decision that would prolong operations until the very end of the conflict. The Soviet forces totaled approximately 800,000 troops, 750,000 Russians and 50,000 Latvian communists, with 3,000 armored vehicles and 4,700 aircraft, distributed among multiple armies under the command of Marshals Bagramian, Yeremenko, and Eremenko, forming an arc from the Lithuanian border to the Latvian capital. On October 16, 1944, The first Soviet attempt to break the resistance in Kurzeme began. The offensive focused on a 40-kilometer front between Prikule and Pikeliai, near the Lithuanian border, with the strategic port of Liepaja as the main objective. The advance was led by the 6th Guards Army and the 51st Soviet Army, preceded by a massive aerial and artillery bombardment that included Katyusha rocket launchers and some Nebelwerfer captured from the enemy. The operation turned out to be a complete disaster for the Soviet forces. Although they managed to seize Marsakai from the 12th Panzer Division, the advance was quickly neutralized by the effective response of the 563rd Volksgrenadier Division along with the 4th and 14th Panzer Divisions. Soviet losses reached such high levels that their formations were paralyzed. In the eastern sector, the 2nd Baltic Front joined the assault with its 22nd Army, initially managing to open a breach between Aus and Saldus. However, their advance was decisively halted near Dobele and Zugste by the tenacious resistance of the 19th Latvian SS Grenadier Division. This unit managed to hold off the assault of 13 enemy divisions practically without support between October 17th and 19th. Simultaneously, in the neighboring region of Jurmala, the Soviet 3rd Shock Army encountered an impenetrable wall formed by the 281 Security Division and the 205 227th and 290th Infantry Divisions. With the Soviet momentum disrupted, the German 18th Army launched a counterattack on October 24th, taking advantage of the exhaustion of the 1st Baltic Front forces deployed south of the perimeter. The operation, executed by General Furch's X-Corps with a provisional force that included the 4th and 14th Panzer Divisions, the 30th Infantry Division, and the 31st and 563rd Volksgrenadier Divisions, achieved limited but significant successes. In just 48 hours, they regained 3 kilometers of muddy ground and, on October 26th, recaptured the Vaynod district. Only 24 hours after the first failure on October 27th, a new, larger-scale Soviet offensive was launched. This time, approximately 60 divisions from the 3 Baltic fronts mounted a coordinated attack against the entire defensive perimeter of Courland. One of the most intense engagements took place in the eastern sector, where the 3rd Shock Army managed to dislodge the 215th Infantry Division from its initial positions. However, the Soviet advance was halted by an elaborate system of fortifications around Lake Lilos and subsequently by a determined counterattack from the 121st Infantry Division. The Luftwaffe's 21st Anti-Aircraft Artillery Division experienced critical moments when it became encircled in Aux. Its situation was only resolved thanks to a rescue operation carried out by the 12th Panzer Division and the 389th Infantry Division, which broke the encirclement and allowed the besieged troops to rejoin the defensive line. Nearby, the Soviet 6th Guards Army succeeded in penetrating the forward trenches previously battered by artillery, infiltrating with a mechanized force between Vainoda and Skłodas. Hundreds of T-34, KV-1, and Stalin 1S2 tanks advanced only 8 kilometers before falling into a perfectly orchestrated trap. From the flanking forests, infantry units equipped with Panzerfausts and camouflaged PK-38 anti-tank guns opened fire, while a formation of 37 Panthers executed a frontal assault that destroyed dozens of Soviet armored vehicles. Soviet air cover was less effective than expected due to adverse weather conditions. A squadron of Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters led by Dieter Hrabak took advantage of the cloud cover to shoot down 5 enemy aircraft. Despite these losses, the Soviet Air Force managed to inflict significant damage in Auts and especially on the port facilities of Liepaja. On October 28th, amid the ongoing Soviet offensive, the 4th Panzer Division, which until then had successfully contained the attacks in Prikule, executed a localized counteroffensive. The operation included elements of the 30th Infantry Division, several Panthers, and 4 Tigers. Although this action advanced less than 10 kilometers before being stopped near a site by the Soviet 29th Rifle Division, it had a disproportionate impact. At the cost of around 300 own casualties, it inflicted considerably higher losses on the enemy and destroyed 40 tanks, including approximately a dozen of the formidable Stalin IS-2 model. Following the counterstrike by the 4th Panzer Division on October 29th, the 1st Baltic Front renewed its offensive against this unit. However, this new assault was again neutralized in the sector between Prekul and Skłodas, thanks to the timely arrival of reinforcements. The 14th Panzer Division, the 30th Infantry Division, and the multinational fighters of the 11th SS Panzer Division, Nordland, mainly composed of Dutch, Norwegian, and Danish volunteers. The same pattern repeated on October 31st in Prekul, where the Soviet 23rd, 212th, 356th, and 415th Rifle Divisions suffered considerable losses due to the forest camouflage tactics employed by the armoured units and infantry of the 14th Panzer Division under the command of General Munzel. The only significant advances made by the Red Army occurred in the central sector of Latvia, where they managed to penetrate approximately 6 kilometers into the area defended by Group Grasser. However, this progression was definitively halted by a combination of factors: the swampy terrain, the accurate fire of the Luftwaffe's 21st Anti-Aircraft Artillery Division, and the staunch resistance of the 83rd and 389th Infantry Divisions. The attackers suffered heavy losses when facing the nearly impenetrable fortifications of the Brunhilde Line. The deteriorating autumn weather turned Kurzeme into an impassable quagmire, forcing the Soviet High Command, Stavka, to suspend all large-scale operations from November 7th onward. From that point, military activity was limited to minor engagements, localized skirmishes, artillery duels, and Soviet air raids on rear targets, especially aimed at the port facilities of Ventspils and Liepāja. In the latter location, a naval mine caused the sinking of the 2,150-ton German freighter Schiffbeck, resulting in the loss of a valuable cargo that included various weapons and artillery. On November 19th, taking advantage of the apparent benefit of frozen terrain, the First Baltic Front resumed its offensive. This initiative soon revealed two serious tactical errors. First, the daytime warming melted the frozen surface. Second, the preparatory artillery bombardment further destabilized the ground. The result was disastrous for the Soviet mechanized forces, whose vehicles became stuck in the mud just as they had managed to penetrate up to 10 kilometers into the defensive lines. This vulnerability was quickly exploited by the defenders, as experienced dramatically by the 103rd Rifle Division near Kroth and another armoured column south of Pelchi. For 7 consecutive days, the attackers suffered heavy losses and widespread setbacks, with isolated exceptions such as the mechanized group that on November 26th managed to establish advanced artillery positions that interrupted the vital railway link between Jelgava and Liepāja. Between late November and early December, weather conditions practically suspended all Soviet operations. However, Army Group Courland faced its own challenges with a dysentery epidemic that severely affected its ranks. The landscape of Kurzeme was transformed under a white mantle as temperatures dropped to -15 degrees Celsius, severely affecting the morale of both sides. Units devoted more effort to combating the environmental conditions, draining flooded trenches and reinforcing parapets to contain mudslides, than to direct combat. Only aerial activity continued with some consistency, highlighting figures such as pilot Lydia Shulakina, who shot down 2 German aircraft, and the renowned Armenian aviator Nelson Stefanian, who was shot down by enemy fighters over Liepāja on the 14th. On December 21st, another Soviet offensive phase began, following the usual pattern: intense preparatory bombardment followed by a massive assault of infantry and armor. The first blow struck Saldus, targeting the 563rd Volksgrenadier Division and several infantry divisions, 132nd, 205th, 218th, 225th, and 226th, 339th. The pressure forced positions to be abandoned and allowed the Soviets to disrupt the Saldus-Liepāja rail connection. Simultaneously, the Soviet Third Shock Army launched a similar operation against the Latvian 6th SS Corps, whose volunteers initially managed to contain the assaults near Pampali. The critical situation was only stabilized by the timely arrival of the 912th Self-Propelled Battalion under General Branner, whose tank destroyers destroyed 26 Soviet tanks, mainly T-34 and Stalin 1S-2 models, thus avoiding an immediate collapse of the front. On December 22nd, Soviet forces renewed their offensive against the Latvian 6th SS Corps in Pampali, encountering even more determined resistance than the previous day. This time, the Latvian defenders had crucial support from a German armoured force composed of 10 Tigers and 20 Panthers, quickly mobilised from the 4th Panzer Division. Faced with this new failure on December 23rd, the Soviet command implemented a psychological strategy to pit Latvians against Latvians. They deployed the 201st Motorized Division and the 308th Rifle Division, both composed of pro-Soviet Latvians, against their compatriots of the 19th Latvian SS Grenadier Division. Initially, this tactic paid off when the communist Latvian units expelled their opponents from Lestina, pushing them 3 kilometers back to Juxta. However, the advance was halted there thanks to the intervention of the rest of the Latvian 6th SS Corps and elements of the Latvian Auxiliary Police. Christmas Eve passed relatively quietly, but Christmas Day brought a new Soviet assault against the Latvian positions in Juxta. This attempt also failed, especially when the 19th SS Division was reinforced on December 27th by the 93rd on December 28th. The pro-Soviet 308th Latvian Division achieved a limited advance of 2 kilometers against the 93rd Infantry Division. However, this gain proved fleeting. The next day, the 19th SS Division counterattacked, reclaiming part of the ground and culminating in a devastating victory in Rumbas on January 31st. This confrontation between compatriots caused such a wave of desertions in the 308th Division that the Soviet command was forced to withdraw it entirely from the Courland front. The 19th SS Division consolidated its reputation on January 5, 1945, with another successful counterattack from the southeast of Juxt, regaining an additional 3 kilometers and confirming its status as one of the most effective formations in the entire campaign. And 227th Infantry Divisions, forming an impenetrable wall. After these setbacks, the Red Army suspended major operations until January 23rd, when the 3 Baltic fronts launched a new assault against the Saldus and Juxta sectors. The result followed the previous pattern. The German-Latvian defenders, perfectly entrenched in forest positions and equipped with Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck anti-tank weapons, neutralized the first Soviet wave without major difficulties. In the Prikul sector, the forces of the Soviet 6th Guards Army and the 51st Army were effectively contained by the tank destroyers of the 912th Self-Propelled Battalion on January 25th. Simultaneously, columns of the 2nd Baltic Front were paralyzed in Skłodas by the solid defense of the 14th Panzer Division and the Scandinavian volunteers of the 11th SS Division Nordland. On February 3rd, Soviet commanders were forced to cancel the operation permanently, withdrawing with devastating losses. Thousands of men and hundreds of armored vehicles destroyed or severely damaged. At the beginning of 1945, Army Group Courland underwent a significant leadership restructuring, with General Lothar Rendulic taking command after the departure of General Ferdinand Schörner. During this period, the Kriegsmarine facilitated the maritime evacuation through the Baltic Sea of several key units: the 4th Panzer Division, the 11th SS Panzer Division Nordland, and the 215th Infantry Division, which were relocated to ports in northern Germany. At the same time, about 2,500 Latvian volunteers were transported in the opposite direction, joining the Latvian 6th SS Corps to defend their homeland. The civilian exodus was equally significant, with approximately 4,500 Latvians escaping to neutral Sweden, thanks to the collaboration of the Latvian Organization for Collective Resources and Contacts, which provided small boats for this rescue operation. On February 20th, 1945, at dawn, Soviet forces launched their most powerful assault against Courland, employing 21 divisions. Their strategy aimed to split the Axis 16th and 18th Armies, preceding the attack with intense bombardment that devastated the defensive lines between Prikula and Juxta. This time, the attackers achieved significant advances, quickly overrunning the German-Latvian front lines and encircling General Kurt Heyling's 126th Infantry Division in Prikul. Surprisingly, the encircled troops managed to break out 2 days later, retreating north and abandoning the enclave to the Soviet 51st Army. 7 days later, on March 1st, the 3rd Baltic Front managed to breach the Tukums line. After bloody fighting against the 19th Latvian SS Grenadier Division and the 24th Infantry Division, who were forced to retreat toward the shores of Lake Zebras, the Soviets captured Juxt. This operation positioned the Red Army just 20 kilometers from the port of Liepaja and 18 kilometers from Tukums. The last Soviet offensive in Courland began on March 18, 1945, once again with artillery preparations and airstrikes. The assault was concentrated south of Saldus, defended by Group Grasser. As in previous occasions, the Soviet forces were effectively repelled in a wooded terrain dotted with farms by concealed elements of the 11th Infantry Division and subsequent counterattacks by the 12th and 14th Panzer Divisions. After this repeated failure, Marshal Ivan Bagramian, leader of the First Baltic Front, and General Andrei Yeremenko, commander of the Second Baltic Front, called an urgent meeting to analyze the situation, as the advances in Courland were minimal compared to the disproportionate human and material losses. With Stalin's approval, they decided to cease offensives and establish a reduced blockade force, allocating the bulk of their units to the invasion of Germany. On March 4th, the three Baltic fronts were dissolved, leaving 5 Soviet armies as the only besieging force under the command of General Leonid Govorov, all subordinated to the Leningrad front. From April 1945, activity on the Courland Peninsula was limited to localized engagements and Soviet air raids on specific targets, mainly the port of Liepaja. After Hitler's suicide in Berlin and the provisional appointment of Admiral Karl Dönitz as head of state, who immediately initiated negotiations with the Allies for the surrender of the Third Reich, the defense of Courland lost all purpose. Between May 3rd and 8th, Dönitz managed to evacuate 20,000 German soldiers from the ports of Liepaja and Ventspils by boat to Germany and Sweden, along with a few dozen men on Junkers Ju-52 aircraft from the Grobina airfield, although of the entire squadron, only 2 aircraft managed to evade Soviet fighters. On May 9, 1945, just one day after the official surrender of the Third Reich to the Allied powers, United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, came into effect, the besieged forces in the Courland enclave laid down their arms to the Red Army, following instructions from their final commander, General Karl Hilpert. Previously, numerous soldiers had disabled or abandoned their military equipment, throwing tanks, artillery, and light weapons into the region's swamps and bodies of water, or transferring them to the Latvian anti-Soviet resistance known as the Forest Brothers. The surrender resulted in the capture of approximately 203,000 personnel from the dissolved army group Courland, comprising 189,112 German soldiers and 20,000 Latvian fighters. Among the prisoners were counted 42 high-ranking officers, specifically 41 German generals and 1 Latvian general. The 20th Estonian SS Grenadier Division, the last warriors of the Baltics. One of the SS divisions that took part in this battle was the 20th Estonian SS Grenadier Division. Barely a year after the launch of Operation Barbarossa and coinciding with the anniversary of the recapture of Tallinn, the formation of the Estonian SS Legion was made public in the summer of 1942. This unit, initially composed of 800 Estonian volunteers, increased its number to 1,280 troops. The recruits received their military training at the Debicka barracks in Poland before being incorporated in February 1943 into the 5th SS Panzer Division, Viking. There they were assigned as part of the Estonian SS Panzer Grenadier Battalion, Narva, a unit that would later become known simply as the SS Battalion Narva. The SS Battalion Narva began its deployment in rear-line duties, participating in operations against communist partisans. However, in July 1943 it was transferred to the Eastern Front, specifically to the locality of Andreyevka, south of Kharkov, on the border between Ukraine and Russia. It was in this sector that the unit starred in a heroic resistance, facing Soviet forces that were numerically far superior. During the fierce fighting, the battalion suffered 643 casualties, but inflicted devastating losses on the Red Army, with over 7,000 Soviet soldiers killed or captured. In recognition of its performance in the battle, 40 of its members were awarded the Iron Cross. At the beginning of 1944, the SS Battalion Narva became trapped in the Korsun-Cherkasy pocket in western Ukraine, along with other Axis units. Despite the intensity of the fighting and being on the verge of annihilation, it managed to break the siege and escape to Poland, where it found temporary refuge. After being withdrawn to Estonia, The unit received a massive reinforcement of 15,000 Estonian volunteers, many of whom were former soldiers of the Wehrmacht and the Finnish army. This considerable increase in numbers allowed its expansion and reorganization as the 20th Estonian SS Grenadier Division Estonische, consolidating itself as one of the most important Waffen SS units on the Eastern Front. The 20th SS Grenadier Division Estonia was organized into 3 infantry regiments, the 45th, 46th and 47th SS Grenadier Regiments, along with the 20th SS Artillery Regiment. It also had various specialized units, including rifle, anti-tank, anti-aircraft artillery, engineer and reconnaissance battalions, all under the 20th SS Division designation. The personal weapons used by its soldiers varied from Mauser rifles and MP-40 submachine guns to MG-34 and MG-42 automatic machine guns. French light machine guns FM-24/29 were also used, along with anti-tank weapons such as the Panzerschreck and Panzerfaust. Regarding vehicles, the division had a contingent of 24 Hetzer tanks, as well as a fleet of Schwimmwagen amphibious vehicles, mainly used for reconnaissance and mobility in difficult terrain. The division's official symbol was a stylized E representing Estonia, crossed by a sword. Its shield featured a design similar to the Estonian national flag, with horizontal stripes in blue, black and white. On February 8, 1944, the 20th Estonian SS Grenadier Division, under the command of General Paul Wendt, was assigned to the 3rd SS Panzer Corps and deployed on the western bank of the Narva River, on a front stretching from Lake Peipus to Narva Bay. In this sector, specifically around Vaasa, Siiversti and Vepskula, on February 20th, the unit entered direct combat with the Red Army. The 45th SS Grenadier Regiment charged head-on against the Soviet lines, while the 46th SS Grenadier Regiment conducted a diversionary attack, flanking the enemy and crossing a minefield. This flanking maneuver nearly annihilated the 378th Rifle Division of the Red Army, inflicting thousands of casualties and completely expelling it from the eastern bank of the Narva River. The Estonian soldiers held their positions in the Narva sector for 4 months, until July 25, 1944, when they were transferred to the Tannenburgg line, where they took up defensive positions on the Kinderheim Hills. In this new location, the fighters achieved important victories, such as the expulsion of 2 Soviet divisions from a bridgehead on the Emjogi River and the repulsion of a massive Soviet attack at the Tornimägi Cemetery. In this last battle, even wounded soldiers from the field hospital joined the fight to hold back the attackers. Between September 4th and 6th, the 20th Estonian SS Grenadier Division launched a counter-offensive with the aim of recapturing the city of Tartu. Although the offensive inflicted more than 16,000 casualties on Soviet forces, the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Red Army ultimately forced the Estonians to retreat. In mid-September 1944, with the order to evacuate Estonia, the division faced the difficult decision to abandon its homeland. Although many fighters chose to stay and form the Forest Brothers guerrilla movement, which would remain active well into the Cold War, around 11,000 Estonian soldiers, along with 2,500 Germans and 2,500 Soviet and Jewish prisoners from the Kluga concentration camp, began a retreat to the south, aiming to reach the borders of the Third Reich. At the beginning of 1945, the 20th Estonian SS Grenadier Division was relocated to Neuhammer, with the goal of recovering from the heavy losses sustained during its withdrawal through the Baltic states, East Prussia and Poland. However, they barely had time to rest, as they were quickly sent back to the front to defend the line between the Oder and Neisse rivers. In this position, the division entered combat with the Red Army, fighting in a sector that included the towns of Ober-Glogau, Falkenberg and Friedberg. During these clashes on March 17th, the unit suffered heavy losses after a failed counterattack in Silesia, while on March 19th it achieved a tactical victory by breaking the Soviet encirclement at the town of Goldberg. The final destination of the 20th Estonian SS Grenadier Division was Czechoslovakia, where in May 1945, the Prague uprising led by the Czech resistance coincided with the advancing threat of the Red Army toward the capital. Although most of the Estonian troops fought around the city and managed to retreat successfully westward, a group of 500 volunteers fell into the hands of Czech partisans. Mistaking them for Germans, they subjected them to humiliation and torture before brutally executing them. They were burned alive in a series of human bonfires in a macabre act of vengeance. On May 8, 1945, the 20th Estonian SS Grenadier Division officially surrendered to United States Army troops in Austria. Fortunately for its veterans, the American government granted them visas that allowed them to settle in North America. In addition, a group of 300 former Estonian fighters, led by Captain Vaido Vitre, were reintegrated into military service. Under his command, these men became part of the 4,221st Guards Company, a unit tasked with guarding German war criminals during the Nuremberg trials between 1945 and 1946. Decades later, with the end of the Cold War and Estonia's independence in 1990, the veterans of the 20th Estonian SS Grenadier Division were officially recognized as national heroes. In their honor, the Museum of the Fight for Freedom in Tallinn erected a commemorative monument which bears the following inscription: "To the Estonian volunteers who fought against Bolshevism and for the restoration of Estonia's independence between 1940 and 1945. By 1945, it was evident to everyone that the end of the war was near. Hitler was becoming increasingly detached from reality, and his erratic behavior was reflected in his orders. He also grew increasingly paranoid about his inner circle, convinced that many of his most loyal collaborators were conspiring against him. However, he never lost faith in the Waffen SS. For that reason, it was the only branch of the German military that continued to expand in 1945. In January, the 32nd SS Volunteer Grenadier Division was formed, composed of remnants of other units and personnel from SS schools. In February, the Waffen Grenadier Brigade of the SS Charlemagne was elevated to division status, reaching a strength of 7,340 men. That same month, the 35th SS Police Grenadier Division was created, formed by police units that were transferred into the Waffen SS. In addition, 3 more Waffen SS divisions were created, but they posed no real threat to the enemy, as the SS faced a severe shortage of volunteers and recruits. To compensate, regular army units were incorporated to reinforce the Waffen SS structure. The last division created was the 38th SS Grenadier Division Nibelungen, formed by students and personnel from SS schools. However, it had only 6,000 men, the size of a standard brigade. These were inexperienced, untrained soldiers who had no chance in combat. Army Group Vistula was formed in 1945 to protect Berlin from the Red Army's advance. It fought in the Battle of the Silo Heights and the Battle of Halba in April, but failed to stop the Soviet advance. The Waffen SS were represented in Berlin by the 3rd SS Panzer Corps, known for its excellent performance in the Battle of Narva. However, in Berlin it was only a shadow of what it had been in Narva. It had few men, scarce artillery, and serious supply issues. Even so, the Waffen SS soldiers showed exceptional discipline and bravery in the final defense of Berlin, even though the war was already lost. Heinrich Himmler, architect of the Waffen SS, fled as soon as he learned that Hitler had committed suicide alongside Eva Braun. He initially tried to go unnoticed. Using a forged paybook under the name Sergeant Heinrich Hitzinger, he fled south on May 11th, heading toward Friedrichskoog. On May 21st, Himmler and 2 aides were arrested at a checkpoint established by liberated Soviet prisoners of war and were then handed over to the British Army. On May 23rd, after admitting his true identity, a doctor attempted to examine him. However, Himmler bit down on a hidden cyanide capsule and collapsed to the ground. He died in less than 15 minutes. The Battle of Narva, besides being one of the bloodiest episodes of World War II, showed how greed and fanaticism could lead to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. Hitler, refusing to allow Stalin to reclaim Estonia, ordered his men to fight to the end, even when there was no chance of victory. To him, all the troops of the Third Reich, including his beloved Waffen SS, were expendable. On the other hand, Stalin launched wave after wave of armored units into battle, hoping the Germans would eventually collapse. This meant many men would die, but that was not a problem, as the Red Army was known for its overwhelming numerical superiority. In the bloody months between the lifting of the siege of Leningrad and the fall of the Tannenburgg line to Soviet tanks, 500,000 men perished on that remote isthmus in northern Estonia. However, the stories of bravery of the fanatical Waffen SS, as well as the importance of this battle in the final Allied victory in 1945, will live on forever.